basin management action plans and total maximum daily loads. And that has to do with the assimilation of these pollutants in the water and how much the water can take before it becomes hyper-eutrophic or eutrophic. So these basin management action plans are put together by the municipal governments and scientists and engineers mostly to do restoration projects to try to decrease the nitrogen problems. And so a lot of them have spent a lot of dollars on having a whole city inventory to kind of determine, and it's billions of dollars worth of problems that have occurred, and really their budgetary is probably 2 or 3 projects a year, so they may have like 15 years of projects and can only get through 1 or 2 a year of those. The Florida Department of Agriculture, which is FDACS, I told you a little bit about that before. They require people who apply fertilizer, like a Roundup license, to have a fertilizer license. And so if you hire someone to put fertilizer out, maybe that would be a good question to put a little pressure on them to say, are you Green Industries Best Management Practice certified, and do you have your fertilizer license? And a lot of people will say no because it's not that popular to do that, but it is the law. Also, each company that produces fertilizer is supposed to register that fertilizer, and they're supposed to, through the FDACS, and they pay a certain amount of money to the state. So there's a huge trust fund that is not utilized to solve some of these water quality issues, but I'm not really sure if that goes into the general budget or what. So fertilizer topics, why do we use it? Because we like to make things grow fast, and we like plants, you know, have certain, if your soils are poor soils, the quality of your soil, not a lot of organics, you're mostly sandy soils, it's hard, and especially to grow turf grass, and to grow turf grass in the shade is difficult as well. What people have done is they've done research and to adjust these nutrient deficiencies, so it's kind of like overfeeding it because you're filling the area with the nutrients, and then the roots only can take up so much, and then that will either percolate down or it runs off. So it runs off into our water environment. So these are the different grass types here that we can choose in Florida. This is our typical St. Augustine. We have a palmetto brand or variety. They keep coming up with some new varieties. We have zoysia grass, which is, I think, this one right here. Bahia grass, which I don't have a picture of. Bermuda and centipede, which are kind of grasses that you use on golf courses and different areas like that. But there's probably a total of about 10 different types of grasses you can grow in Florida depending on your use and where you're going to go. They have different textures and different looks, but a lot of people like that lush, thick, grown on long rhizomes instead of Bahia grass, which is grown in little tufts. And so Bahia grass is kind of like when you mow, it's kind of like when you comb your hair, how your hair comes out. Well, those long seed heads are very tough, and your mower kind of rips, so it rips out a lot. So it's not as lush and green, but it is a very resilient grass that doesn't need a lot of fertilizer and doesn't need a lot of water. So alternatives to grass, there's quite a few. It's not an easy go. It could take you up to 2 years to get a full coverage, and then some of them, they go to sleep in the winter time, and so if you have an aesthetic neighborhood that gets a little frustrated, then you might be able to seed that with some winter rye and cover it up and create that lush type of grass. But you see up here, some of them grow in sun and some of them grow in shade. And so this right here is mondo grass, and so they plant it on like 12-inch centers, 6-inch centers, and eventually it grows in. And up here is Asiatic jasmine, and that's one where if you are cheap about it and you plant it on 2-foot centers in an area, it takes maybe 2 to 3 years to grow in. If you plant it on closer centers, it can spread and grow. And the hard part about getting an Asiatic jasmine area to take over is you plant it, you water it, then you mulch it with a fine mulch, and then you have to consistently weed it. Because once those weeds get in underneath the root systems of those plants, then you have a difficult time. So it's pretty labor intensive. Down here we have some Wedelia, which is kind of a plant that was a house plant that people threw out in their yards, and it takes over very well. Some of the native plant enthusiasts are very upset about it, but I think it's a really great ground cover. I'm not too picky. Here you have a Sunshine Mimosa. It has really cool Dr. Seuss little flowers. Now this one does die back in the winter, and it doesn't flower all the time. Here you have perennial peanut. And there's probably like 7 to 10 different types of perennial peanuts that you can buy. Some people buy it and they get it mailed to them from the north, which probably isn't a good idea because it's not acclimated for our Florida soils and our Florida temperature variations. The beach or June sunflower, and then there's just the plain old whatever grows it's green and you mow it and it's kind of okay to deal with it. So just the Florida grass. There's a lot of crabgrass and different native plants that grow in that mixture. So choosing a fertilizer, of course we talked about you need to do a soil test. And the nitrogen requirements of each of those grasses, St. Augustine, zoysia, the centipede, and those other ones have different amounts of nitrogen recommended. The University of Florida has some good books on how much to apply, but zoysia grass uses less water and less fertilizer, and sometimes when people switch over, it grows slower and that they get a little frustrated with it. And then the St. Augustine, of course, there's a lot of problems with insects and different diseases that come in over time. But other people, you know, it just depends on what variety you get to grow. So also the urban fertilizer turf rule says that you limit no more than 1 pound per 1,000 square foot. So when you read that bag and you're reading that label and you're trying to assimilate how much you're supposed to put out, it can be quite a math issue. So here you can see shoot growth versus root growth. So the higher you let your grass grow, the deeper the roots go. So I always try to keep my grass, my St. Augustine, and I have in some areas I try to let it grow maybe a week and a half to 2 weeks. It's getting a little scary there because the neighborhood might not meet the aesthetic, but that way at least I have deep roots. And when we go through these days, like I was walking around today outside and I noticed all the grass blades were shriveled up and closed and looked kind of bluish, very thirsty. But tomorrow morning when you get up, after the evening happens and the temperatures cool down, you'll see it'll be fine. But a lot of people freak out when they look at their yards and they're looking that way. We got to get water to it, and so it doesn't necessarily work that way. So grasses, and you can see here it goes with the March, the nighttime temperatures, and November when we get our cooler weather. So really the high growing season, if you fertilize here in April and then over the summer, you get into June where we get into the no fertilizing phase or just putting out potash and such. You can see those are the areas that a lot of growth occurs during that time frame because that's when the plant is really active. So there's been controversy over whether these summertime bands are really, you know, the best for it. University research kind of is out there on that. And what I've kind of pieced together is it's not so much about the growing, it's about the density of turf grass you have in your yard. A lot of people will grow grass and they'll get a brown spot and they'll immediately think that brown spot has to do with the amount of water. So they crank up the water. And it could be that simple thing like irrigation where the two spray heads don't meet and you're always going to have a brown spot. Or when you turn up the water, it feeds the fungus that's growing in the soil and then it causes more of an open space. So you're really supposed to go in there and rake out all that dead stuff, open it up, and then plant some plugs there. Now you have open space. And so if you were to fertilize that open space, it won't be taken up by the plants because there's no plants in that space. So the percent cover of turf grass in your yard is critical in the amount of fertilizers that you do.
Yeah, Gabby, on the brown spots and all that, they appear from time to time. Could you just put some potting soil out or compost or something like that, and then just let the grass work its way back into it?
A lot of times that is the solution. If you maybe have a lower, sometimes you put the compost out, or sometimes you put sand out. It would really depend on master gardeners and the extension agency. You can take some of those, a chunk of that turf in, and they can look at it under a microscope or examine it and see that if the roots are brown and thin and spindly, it's a disease like a fungus. And fungicides are their own huge problem with applying them, because when you read the fungicide labels, it's kind of confusing. You're supposed to apply it, and then 2 weeks later apply another amount, and then the third time you're supposed to use another fungicide, because the treatment has to do with the first set of chemical you put out. It kills the weakest funguses. Then the funguses get stronger, and then you put it out again, and then they may die, and then the third time you have to use another chemical because they've already become kind of immune to that fungicide. So you're looking at 6 weeks to get a fungus under control, technically. So that's a lot of chemical spray out there. So fertilizing appropriately, you can see these 3 numbers on the bag: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or N-P. Wait, we'll get to the next page. So for most trees and plants, their fertilizer needs are variable. There was some research done that showed that plant beds, people who fertilize plant beds, had a higher conditions where the nutrients were in the soil, and that's because they weren't uptaken, like I was talking about the holes in the turf grass. So if you are going to feed your plants in your yard, the shrubs and such, you want to do it close to the drip line and adjacent to the stem of the plant. And then fruit trees, of course, are usually required to fertilize, and some of the other things. But a lot of Florida native plants, they really don't like fertilizer. They may move around your yard, but you don't really have to fertilize them. So one thing about putting fertilizer in, a lot of people, when you put the fertilizer out, what occurs is you'll go and you're supposed to turn your irrigation on. Well, you're only supposed to put 1/4 of an inch of water out when you fertilize. And a lot of people run their entire cycle. And so 1 inch of water applied on the surface penetrates the soil 12 inches below. So that's why they say you only need 3/4 of an inch of water to get down into that root zone. And so when you're applying fertilizer, you want that fertilizer to go right down to that area at the lower. So 1/4 of an inch is going to bring it down about 2 to 3 inches. That should be right in that root zone. But a lot of people put it out there and it just washes it off. Some of it's uptaken and some of it percolates down or washes off.
How long would you run your system to get to that amount?
So
there's an equation.
Yeah, but there's a simple, I don't know if you have cats or you eat tuna fish, but you get some cans, some tuna cans, or you can get bamboo shoot cans, whatever, and you put those cans out in your yard, and then you run the system. And then you say, okay, I ran the system, I usually run it for, 15 minutes. So that should probably, depending on the kind of irrigation heads you have, should put that water out and to the right amount, and then you can measure it in the can. So you can kind of do your math that way. So you can, each zone is different because each zone is set up. So sometimes when someone waters their yard, if they have an acre in size, I know that there's like up to 2,000 gallons of water just to go out onto to to a 1 acre yard, and they put it down, you only need that 3/4 of an inch every other day or so. And that's why the watering restrictions were put in place the way they were. It wasn't to penalize people for, to not water. Some of it was convenience because you had one side of the street, one day a week and the other one. So when you would do enforcement, you could see if they do enforcement. But you can see how much water's going out. So the catch can test, pretty cool thing.
And the cat food cans or tuna fish cans could double as snail and slug traps. Just put some cheap beer in it
Yeah.
and put it in the ground low enough so that they can crawl up into it and they will drink themselves dead.
Yeah, that's a lot of when you have a lot of slugs in your yard or snails, typically that means you're overwatering. If you have dollar weed in your yard, typically that means you're overwatering unless you live in a mucky soil area, and then it's just present because it's a wetland plant. And then once you get that established, it's a lot of people would use an herbicide and a broadleaf herbicide to try to get that out. But actually, if you just cut back on your watering for a little bit, it kind of dies out, so it has a natural life to it. So the NPK are the 3 numbers, and then you have your spreaders. And there's also a device that you put on your spreader, a shield, that when you are walking by the waterway, that it won't shoot it out over, into your yard. So here it's the fertilizer is activated by the soil microbes in your yard, and then you apply that 1/4 inch of water. So our soils in Florida, a lot of people say can't do much with them, but we can grow a lot of plants. We have beautiful forests that grow really well in Florida and such. But so soil particles, when they become compacted, they don't actually take water. Has anybody ever had a plant where you forgot to water it and you pour the water in and it just shoots through it?
Mm-hmm.
So that's when you got to kind of soak the plant for a while. So there's, in the soil profile, there's a field capacity. And around each soil particle is a little film of water, hygroscopic water, and that film, once that dries out and is gone, you have to restore it and to get back to that where so your lawn can actually kind of do what your plant did if it isn't watered over time. So during drought periods and things, it's hard to balance some of that because it does have a financial burden on people to have to replace a turf grass.
Does the heavy rain, when we get the heavy rains, does that kind of do the same principle as soaking the plant?
Yes.
And you get the heavy rains, soaks the soil, everything kind of pops up.
Yep, then it gets those films around those particles and it can hold water again. So yes, absolutely. And so once compaction occurs, it's difficult, like I was telling you about, when you take too much water out of the aquifer, the soil compacts the aquifer. And that's a lot of water you got to pour on because you're filling a lot of space there. And in those areas, there's little or no biological activity, so that mycorrhizome and that isn't there, the life isn't there, and it can't really live in the sandy soils. If the beach, you see what kind of plants are really adapted for that dry climate. So these are the kinds of fertilizer: inorganic or synthetic, which are mined or synthesized. So they actually have chemistry that they make it. So we're down in the south part of the state and now up by Gainesville where they're excavating all that. And then there's organic fertilizers, which are old dead stuff basically. And sometimes you can there's a product that they sell from Milwaukee, Wisconsin called Milorganite, which is made out of the biosolids. And the organic matter in organic fertilizers, so if you were just to put compost out on your yard, like David asked about before, that can help to reinvigorate your soil and rebuild your soils and such. And that is really ready to be absorbed by the roots, because the roots have little tiny hairs. And they're like little straws, not plastic ones, but little tiny straws that they drink up the nutrients and help that to go to the cells and grow out of the plant for photosynthesis. So those are the 2 kinds of. Oops, take a look right there. So inorganic fertilizers, mined or synthesized, contain nutrients that immediately available to the plants, or the quick release. So slow release is when they make kind of like an M&M out of the fertilizer particle, and they put a little polymer, a little plastic polymer. It's a kind of a gooey particle, and then that's how you have them where like Osmocote, where it pops over time. You put it out. So a lot of people before the bans go on, they're concerned their grasses are going to get enough food. They'll put out that slow release. So over time, those little capsules will pop.
Little green ones?
Yeah, they have green ones and white ones and the different varieties of the companies. So the quick releases ones are really the man-made ones, and those are the ammonium nitrate. And that, you know, when you pee, ammonia is in your pee, and that's what plants use. They can uptake that to grow pretty well. So there's these different types of fertilizers.
When you say the polymer coated, and then you said something about plastic, does that mean that it's actually a form of plastic? Is that putting plastic in the environment, into the ground? Or,
Yeah, I have to research.
because I know plastics are made with polymers.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. We're
Well,
getting
that's-
plastic there
that's-
too. That's not good for our
That seems
soil.
kind of crazy.
Yeah, but I'm not 100% sure. I could research that for you. So organic fertilizers, slow release, controlled release, they build the soil, less runoff, less leaching. You get rid of the animal wastes and things, and each of the, you know, the chickens and the pig, they all have different P levels, you know, and so they have different nutrients because they all eat different food, and so that is what feeds it. And the cooking scraps, that's not anything with fats or meats. This is totally plant-based materials that you would compost in your yard. So slow release, at least 50%. Over fertilizing makes lawns susceptible to diseases.